Hello, my name is Colin, and in this Blender 2.8 tutorial, we're going to be talking about animation. Now, when somebody says, hey, the animation in the latest Blender Open short movie like Spring or Agent 327, if they say the animation looked great, they're probably actually talking about things like the modeling of the characters and objects, or maybe the cinematography, or the lighting, or the effects in rendering and the quality of the rendering, or maybe just the overall look of the quality of the movie that they watched. But animation is not any of those things. Animation is movement. Animation is the art of creating either character movement in a story, or object motion in real space, or more abstract motion like smoke or fire or any abstract painterly animation that you can possibly think of. Animation is the art of creating motion over time in a movie or animation. So in this video, I'm going to introduce you to how you create animation in Blender 2.8, and it starts off very easy. It's like playing a musical instrument, like the piano. If you can press one key, one note on the piano, you can successfully play a little bit of music. But in order to master that craft, it takes a long time to make very intricate, realistic looking animations. So people practice for months, years of their life to get good animation and make realistic, good character or other types of animation. But you have to start somewhere, so let's go ahead and dive in. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps me out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender 2.8 or using the Godot game engine, click on that subscribe button as well, and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. So in Blender 2.8 and in most computer animation pieces of software, you don't have to animate the old traditional way where you had to draw every single keyframe out of every frame of an object or character's motion. That would be a long use of your time or a bad use of your time. In computer animation, including in Blender, animation is done using what are called keyframes. Keyframes are set down here at the bottom of Blender's interface in your timeline, and keyframes are a way for you to tell an object in your scene, usually a character or something else like this cube. Hey, we'll use that to start. It's a way to tell that object to be at a certain place or at a certain rotation or at a certain scale at a specific time in your animation. So this timeline shows you time in frames, which are frame 1 to frame 250 by default. You can change those numbers here. If you want your timeline or your animation to be longer, you can drag in here. You can change it by clicking and typing in something like 1000 and pressing enter. You can change it back though. We'll talk about this more later. If I go to frame 1 of my animation, and I'm going to orbit around so I can see my scene with the X red axis going side to side. If I want to make this cube go from this side of the screen or scene to this side, I'm going to turn on this auto keying button. This is the easiest way to do animation. When this record or auto keying button is turned on, and I might refer to it later as the red record button, because in old versions of Blender, it used to be red. Now it's just white with blue highlight when it's on. That's off, that's on. When it's turned on and you move or rotate or scale an object, it will set that object at that exact position and orientation at that time. This playhead, by the way, this blue bar with this handle, you can drag around. It's called scrubbing. When you do that, you're scrubbing around your timeline. You can drag it from this point right here. You cannot drag it on the actual bar. This handle is nice and big though, so it's convenient. So on frame 1, with the auto keying button turned on, I'm going to drag with the move tool the cube over and let go. And when I let go, you'll notice that in your timeline, you've got a yellowy, orangey, gold colored diamond. This is a keyframe, and it shows you that with this selected object, you have told it to be at this location, at this scale, and at this rotation, at this exact place, at this time. If I play back or scrub through my timeline, I don't have animation yet because we haven't told it to be anywhere else at any other time. So I'm going to scrub over to frame 24. 24 because that's the number of frames it takes to make 1 second of animation by default. 24 frames per second is the frame rate of traditional movie film. It's a film projector or movie camera's old way of recording film, and that's the rate that became the standard a long time ago. So at frame 24, 1 second later, I'm going to drag the cube over to that side of the screen and let go. You'll notice that it said auto keying on up at the top right, just to remind you. And we've just made another keyframe because auto keying was turned on and we transformed the cube. So now if I press the go back to the beginning button right there and press play, hey, we've got animation. The cube moved from the left to the right in 1 second. If I scrub around, you can see all the in-between frames the computer Blender made for us. Isn't that wonderful? But of course, animation is not just movement. It can be rotation or scale. So if I go to, let's say, frame 24, the last keyframe, I can include more information there, or I can change the information there. I can use the rotate tool. I might want to rotate on this Y, the green axis. And if I start dragging that handle, I can actually hold control and it'll snap to little 5-degree increments. And you'll notice that up in this part of the screen when I'm doing that. So I'm going to press Control Z to undo that rotation. If I grab this green gizmo handle to rotate on the Y-axis, hold Control, I can rotate exactly 90 degrees by watching up the top left of my screen. It says Rot 90-degree global. That's what I want. So now I've got an animation of the cube doing a little bit of flipping as well. If I want to make the cube scale over time, I can go to one of my keyframes and I can tap S or use the scale tool. And if I want to scale uniformly, I can drag in this white circle, the little one, and click and drag. And now the cube will start big, get smaller over time, and rotate all at the same time. So there you go. Animation is really that easy, at least to start. If you want to change the frame rate, how fast your animation goes, you should probably do that right at the very beginning before you start animating. I've got a 1 second animation here because we've got from frame 1 to frame 24. If I go to my output tab, this is the properties editor. The output tab looks like a little printer printing out a picture. In the first section called dimensions at the bottom, you'll see frame rate. Frame rate of 24 frames per second is default. If you live in Europe, your television standard, if you're outputting for television, is 25 frames per second. That's the PAL standard. If you're in North America, it's 29.97 frames per second, which is a relic of the transition between black and white television, which was exactly 30 to color. Don't get me started there. YouTube can play back at 60 frames per second, I think maybe even more now, and you can choose even a custom value if you like. So if you change your value, it will play back at a different rate. It'll also export if you make a movie file at that rate as well. So now if I play back at 60 frames per second, well, this animation is only going to take less than half of a second. Bam. Okay, so that changes things. So you want to set this very early on. Now, in your timeline, you can move keyframes and you can delete keyframes, and this is new in Blender 2.8. If I click on a keyframe, just left click, normal click on a keyframe, it selects it. Selected keyframes are this yellowy, orangey, gold color. If I want to move a keyframe around, I can do that. In fact, I could make this animation go from frame 1 to frame 48, which means it would be, at the default, 2 frames of animation because 2 times 24 is 48. So now if I play back the animation, that's what it looks like. It's half as long. If I undo that, Control Z a few times, I could even go in the middle of this animation and I could, let's say, transform the cube and move it up. And I'll maybe orbit my view and zoom out a little bit as well. So now my animation is changed. It does a little hop. That's wonderful. I could even select multiple keyframes by dragging just somewhere that doesn't have a keyframe and dragging and letting go once I have made a box selection. And I could I can tap G and move those around if I want to. So now my animation doesn't start until frame 25 or so. I can even scale an animation. If I have multiple keyframes selected, I can tap S and scale, and it'll make the animation bigger or smaller. If the animation is bigger, it'll take more time, and therefore it'll be slower. If I make the animation smaller, I can make it go really quick. If I tap S and I go too far, if I cross itself, I can even make the animation reversed. I'm kind of messing things up here because animation scaling or keyframe scaling down here in the timeline happens in relation to this playhead. So I'm going to press Control Z many times to undo my animation so it goes from 1 to 24 again. If I want to make this animation twice as long, I can go to frame 1, because if I scale right now, it scales away from that playhead. If I have my playhead, let's say over here, and I tap S, well, it'll scale away or towards that playhead, okay? So if I undo that, go back to frame 1, I can scale out the animation nicely from the beginning. You can even tap S and then tap a number, a modifier, like 2. So S and then 2, and then enter will make the animation twice as long, or at least it should. So now it goes from frame 1 to frame 47. I'm not sure why it does that. It should be at 48, so I can just move it over and fudge it a little bit. Okay, so now that the animation plays back over 2 seconds, and I like it for the most part. But if I want to, let's say, have more control of my animation, and now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how you can control your animation, have a better workflow, and really fine-tune things. When I use this auto keyframing button, it is not letting me choose what kind of data I'm recording, at least by default, with these keyframes. So if I actually want to look and see what these keyframes are actually doing, well, if I were to, let's say at the beginning of this video, I made the cube rotate from point A over here to point B over here by just rotating it at the last frame by 90 degrees. Remember that? Well, at the first keyframe, I didn't tell it to be rotated in any which way, but it still stayed at that rotation. When I rotated it at the last keyframe, it knew to stay rotated at that first rotation automatically. It wasn't actually automatic. It's done because when you use auto keyframing, you are setting the location and rotation and scale every time you move or rotate or scale anything. Even if you just want to do a movement, it records the information for rotation and scale as well. I can show you that by making my timeline a little bit taller and then pressing this little tiny arrow that's hidden at the side of your timeline. Hopefully you can see that right there. If you click on it, you can expand a sidebar. Is it a key on the keyboard? No, I don't see a key. It's not the T, the tool shelf, or the N key for the properties panel. I don't know what the keyboard shortcut is for that, but it's there. There's a summary of all the keyframe channels or tracks. If I expand this out, you can see that the cube is listed here. That's the object's name. If I expand that and expand that, you can see that there are lots of keyframes or partial kind of sub keyframes for location, rotation, and scale. Okay, so even if you just move the cube, you're still setting its scale and rotation at that time. But what this can do for you is it might interrupt your animation in certain ways. Let's say I want my cube to do a flip. So it's sitting on the ground or somewhere like this, flat, and I want it to flip maybe 180 degrees. Well, right now I've got it jumping and it only rotates 90 degrees from this point to this point, and there's this rotation keyframe in the middle. Well, if I were to go to my last keyframe and rotate 90 degrees more, so if I rotate 90 degrees, I'll hold the control down to snap, and I'll go to 90 and let go. Of course, you can type R, Y, and 90 and enter too using modifier keys. But now, if I look at my object data here with the cube selected, I'm rotated 180 degrees. But if I look through my animation, I want you to see what happens. The cube only rotates from 0 degrees to about 45 degrees, 47.9, between the first and second keyframes in the first half of the animation. And then in the second half of the animation, it rotates a whole lot. So it's not a nice progression of animation because of the way that it recorded keyframes. If I play this back, you'll see the rotation is slow at the beginning and it speeds up at the end. I don't want that. Well, I could go back and modify these keyframes. I could select all 3 rotation keyframes, these 3 right here, just by clicking and dragging. And I could press X or delete on my keyboard and then click on delete. So now it only knows for rotation the start and the end keyframes. And now you'll see it rotates much more evenly. It rotates kind of progressively, incrementally from frame 1 to frame 48 over the entire rotation. Maybe I want the same thing with scale. Maybe I want it to scale from small at the beginning, or maybe very big at the beginning, to small at the end, but maybe this middle keyframe is getting in the way. Maybe it's not really scaling at the right proportion, especially if I were to make it bigger at the end. I've got auto keying still turned on, so it's still letting me set keyframes. I want it big at the end, and it's getting small in the middle for some reason. Well, I can delete those keyframes as well, okay? So you have lots of control here. Now, this isn't the best workflow. Maybe you want to instead only insert the type of keyframe that you want. This is where, and I'm going to delete this object, so I'll press X with it selected. I'm going to turn off auto keying, and I'm going to make a new object. This time, yeah, I'll just add a mesh cube again. And maybe my cube only should have movement animation. To do this, I'm not going to turn on the record or auto keyframe button this time. Instead, I'm going to set keyframes manually by pressing the I key on my keyboard. So I'm going to use my move tool, move my cube to where I want it to be. I'm going to actually tap G and Z and 1 and enter to move it 1 up on the Z axis, so it's sitting on the floor, G, then Z, then 1, then enter. And there are no keyframes yet. In fact, I'm not even at the right keyframe, or frame in my timeline. So I'm going to go to frame 1. And now if I want to insert a keyframe of this cube here, after I've put it there, I can tap I on my keyboard. The letter I will bring up the insert keyframe menu. And these are all called keying sets. Keying sets allow you to record different types of data to a keyframe. If I only want to have location, I can choose just location. The default is with the auto keying button. If I tap I, it is rote scale. There it is. That's the default for the auto keying button. If I just select with the I key location, and then I go and look at the keyframe data of this cube, you can see we now just have 3 tracks, not 9 like before. If I go to later in my timeline, let's say frame 48, and I move the cube over. Again, we don't have animation until I tap I up here and say the kind of keying information or keying set that I want, location. And so now I have just that animation. And now if I change the scale or rotation, I'll do the same thing as I did at the beginning of this video. At frame 48, I rotated, I'm going to use the rotate tool on the y-axis, 90 degrees, just like that. But now, because even if I insert a keyframe of rotation on frame 48, well, there was no information recorded there like before, so now it's going to be rotated like that throughout the entire time. I have to manually control it, and that might be a better workflow for you, so you're actually controlling things and doing things intentionally. If I tap R right now on frame 1, R, and then Y, and then -90, so RY -90, enter on my keyboard. Then I tap I rotation. I've just rotated -90 degrees and inserted that keyframe. So I can now have a rotation animation in my keyframe. I just set those three keyframes, manually just then. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. This might be getting a little bit more deep than you're ready for at first, but it is a good thing to keep in mind. If you want to use, we'll continue going on here, if you want to use the auto keying button and you want to have it just do, let's say, one of those keying sets and not rote scale by default, you can go up to keying. This is on the header of your timeline. Keying, and choose an active keying set. I'm going to actually make a new cube because it tends to work better that way. And add Shift A to bring up the add menu, add mesh cube. I'm going to change my keying set to one of those options. I can keep scrolling down on my mouse wheel. I'm going to choose just location. Now, it will, if I use the I key right now, if I have a keying set deliberately chosen, if I use the I key, and let's say I move my cube over here and tap I, you'll notice that it didn't prompt me with that long insert keyframe menu anymore. It only does that if you have not set an active keying set. In this case, when I tapped I just did it again, it only inserted the active keying set key, so location keyframes. And I can change that at any time that I want. I can choose anything else. If I go to a later time, like at frame 48, and I move the cube over and I tap I on my keyboard, it won't give me that menu again. It'll just insert the active keying set. Now, funny enough, I'm going to delete this cube and add a new cube. And if I want to do the same thing with the auto keying button, and I've set my keying set right here. Turns out your auto key button does not use this active keying set by default, and I don't like this part of Blender's interface. I hope they change it. There's this button right here. There's no name on it. It's pretty, keys. That's great. This button, if I hover over it, it says Auto Keyframe Insert Keying Set. Automatic keyframe insertion, pardon me, using active keying set only. That's hard to find, and it's not very obvious. They should put it up here, I think. But if you have that button selected and it's blue, this record button, the auto keying button, will use your active keying set. So I've got it set, I've got the blue button on, I've got auto keying turned on. If I go to frame 1, move the cube over, and check out what keyframes it made. There we go. It only made location even with this button. I don't have to press I every time on frame 48. If I move the cube over 2 seconds later, it only made those keyframes. Okay? Before we go any further though, I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. The timeline is your space to look at keyframes in an animation and move them and edit them and delete them as you choose. But it's only 250 frames long by default. And you might have an animation that's 1,000 keyframes from 1 to 1,000. That actually corresponds with your output settings. If you're outputting rendering frames out to your computer or a video file out to your computer, these numbers change when you change these and vice versa. So if I change it to, let's say 500 and press enter, it changes right here. That's really nice. But what if you want to only focus on one little bit of an animation, let's say 1 to 50, and you want to have it play back and not just keep going. So if you press play, it keeps going and it just keeps going, and that can get annoying. You want to maybe loop in a smaller preview area that you're working on right now, because character animation takes a lot of looking at it and playing it back and wanting to see it again and again. You don't have to change these numbers. You can use what's called a preview range. And a preview range happens when in this timeline editor window, if you press P on your keyboard, the letter P, you'll get these little dashed lines through your mouse. If you then click and drag and let go, you're setting a preview range. And I'll show you what that looks like. If you let go, you will brown out. I'm not sure why they chose brown, part of your timeline. And this little stopwatch timer button turns active. This is your use preview range button. So now if I play back my animation, it's only going to use the preview range of 0 to 55. And that way I can check this animation out and watch it again and again to refine it and work on it and just play back that one zone. If I turn this button off, I'm no longer using the preview range. If I'm using the preview range and I want to clear it out, I can press Alt-P with my mouse down here. Alt-P will clear your preview range and turn it off. So that's a really handy thing in Blender. It'll happen, and you'll want to use that more often than you might think. When you're just starting out animation, it is truly handy. Okay, so getting into more technical parts of animation, if I were to use that preview range, I'm going to press P again and just watch my animation of my cube from 1 to 50 or so. You might notice that the cube is not moving at an even increment throughout the animation. It's not moving at a constant or linear speed if you're thinking about this motion on a graph. In fact, there is a graph editor. We're not going to quite get to it yet, but I'll show you it and show you what's happening. I'm going to split my timeline window into 2, so I've got it nice and tall. If you put your mouse over the top corner of a window, you can get these little plus mouse icon. And if you drag left or down from the top, you can split the window into 2. So I like that. I'm going to change this window type into this is how you change it, this button, to a graph editor. Right there. This graph editor will show you in like mathematical XYZ curves. And if I go to view all, which is also the home key on an extended keyboard, you can see everything. This red axis corresponds, and the direction the cube is moving corresponds to this line in terms of a cube's movement. So if I were to play this back again and again and again, you might notice that the speed of the cube changes over the time that it moves. The cube starts off a little bit slower, then it speeds up, and then it slows down again. I'm going to just let you watch that a few times through. Do you notice it? It's very subtle. It's called ease in and ease out. It's one of the principles of animation, and it's something that Blender does by default because the default interpolation type. Interpolation means how it positions the keyframes between, or frames between your keyframes. I'll say that again, how it calculates and positions the frames it puts in there for you between your keyframes. Interpolation can be controlled by you. The default is this Bezier. It means you have these handles that you can adjust. We'll talk about that later. But if I go back and let's say select my first keyframe and I press T on my keyboard, T like the letter T, with my mouse in this window, you'll get this pop-up that comes up. There are three kinds of interpolation: constant, linear, and Bezier. Bezier is the default. It includes easing in and easing out. If I change it to linear, just with this first keyframe, the first keyframe controls the timing right after it, so until the next keyframe. So now if I go and play back this animation in the preview range again, you'll see that the motion is a bit more scientific or mathematical, or even there's no nice, starting from a slow and then speeding up and then slowing back down again. It's just at kind of a constant or really a linear rate. And in my graph editor, you can see that too. You can see it's just moving from point A. It's time and distance traveled, or motion on the up and down axis in your graph. So yeah, it's just moving at a constant rate. But it's not really constant, it's linear. If you were to select that first keyframe again, press T and select constant. Constant means that there's actually no interpolation at all. So from frame 1, if I press play, there's no motion until it gets to that last keyframe. In other words, if I looked at my graph, there it is. The X direction or axis movement doesn't do anything, doesn't change in its location until it's told to do so at frame 48. This is actually good for camera motion. If you want to switch between different camera angles without blending between and having your camera fly around. Really quickly, I'm going to change the cube back to Bezier. So now it goes from one to the other and interpolates in between. I'm going to go to my camera view. I'm going to make this a bit smaller. So if I press the camera button, I can do that. I'm going to make the camera easier to control. I'm going to press N to bring up my side properties panel, and then view. Under view, I'm going to select lock camera to view. When I do that, I can then orbit and change my camera view on my screen looking through my camera. If I don't have that checked, it just breaks out of the camera. That's a good thing to know. It's the N properties panel, or this little arrow up there as well. Okay, so I'm going to position my camera on frame 0. I've got my auto keying button turned on actually, which is a little bit dangerous. I'll leave it on for now. I'm going to make a wide shot of my whole scene, and if I scrub through and actually look at my camera's keyframes, I'm going to select the camera. You can see on frame 0, it's been told to be at this location, and then I've got auto keying turned on. If I go to frame, let's say 21, and I zoom in and pan down, you can see that it made a keyframe of my camera at frame 21, and it flies in, it zooms in. I don't want that. I want to switch camera angles to be like a jump shot. So it switches from this camera angle and it stays at this camera angle until frame 21, and then I want to zoom in. In fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll orbit around so it kind of gets a flyby shot. There we go. So my camera's keyframes are, and by the way, the timeline shows the object keyframes that you're currently on. I'll talk about that in a moment. But so if you want to see the keyframes for the camera, you have to select the camera, and then you see the keyframes for that. And if you want to see the cube, you select the cube. Okay, so it shows the keyframes of the object that you're currently on. If I select my camera's keyframes, it's interpolating now from this camera angle. Why did it change? I'm not sure. Let's change it back on frame 0. And oh, you know why? Because I'm using my auto keying set. I'm going to select local scale. Aha. So at frame, I'm going to tap I. In fact, I'm going to turn off my keying and make sure local scale is set there. And then it is going to be right about there. And I local scale, just to make sure I'm getting all my types of keyframes. So I don't want it to do that. That's a really not nice camera motion. So I'm going to select my first keyframe, tap T, and select constant. And therefore, now my camera will just jump to that other nice camera angle. Okay, so that's what you can use that for. I'm going to get rid of all the keyframes. I'll press A and then X. A selects all. X will delete all those keyframes, and I'll jump out of my camera. Okay, so that's keyframe interpolation. You've got 3 options with the T key. No matter what kind of animation editor, timeline, or graph editor you're in, you can press T and get constant linear or Bezier. Before we move on to talking about the graph editor, really quick, if you want to be able to see multiple objects, keyframes at once, you'll notice that, if I've got two objects in my scene, I'm going to add a mesh, let's say a UV sphere, and I'm going to animate that. I've got it selected. You'll notice that I don't see the keyframes or even my cube listed anymore. But if I want to, let's say, have them go past each other on frame 1, maybe I'll have the sphere go back there. And on frame 48 or so, I'm going to have the sphere be over here. And are they going to collide? Yeah, sure. Why not? If I want to see both objects at the same time, I cannot do that in my timeline. The timeline is only for one object at a time unless you hold shift up here and select multiple objects at the same time, which can be a little bit annoying. In Blender, you can make another window, another editor on your screen. So I'm going to split my 3D editor window into two. I'm going to grab up here and drag straight down. And I'm going to make what's called a dope sheet window or editor. The dope sheet editor is like a super timeline, and no matter what you have selected, you can see all your objects listed. If you turn this little button on, which may be on by default, it'll only show you the selected objects keyframes like the timeline, but you can turn it off and then it'll show you everything, and you can see everything all at the same time. And you can zoom in on your different frames or have a big wide shot of all your whole 500 frames of animation look like, and then zoom in on your timeline. So that's kind of nice. Going back to our graph editor though, if I select my cube and then if I expand in this graph editor window, all the different tracks of animation, I've got everything on here, loc, rot, and scale. And I want to be able to understand what's going on here. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to hide this sidebar just to make everything less cluttered. And I'll make this a bit narrower over here. If I want to only focus on, let's say, the left, right, the x-axis motion of my cube, I can hide everything that I don't want to see. So location is the one that I do want. So I'm going to just click and drag and hide all those with the eyeballs. And then I can click on this line, or one of the keyframes rather, to show it. The type of interpolation that my cube currently has on this first keyframe, if I press T, is Bezier. That's what it has. And Bezier gives you access to what are called Bezier handles, and you can adjust them on both keyframes. There are these circles with the orange lines that you can drag around to manipulate the curve, which is actually the interpolation between different keyframes. So if you want to exaggerate the easing in and easing out, in other words, the slow down and speed up of your animation, well, you can drag these handles out. And I've got a middle keyframe too, which again might get in the way. But if I play my animation now, you'll see that the animation, and I'm going to actually get rid of that middle keyframe just for the sake of seeing what's going on here. You'll see that the animation starts even slower and then it speeds up. And I'm going to make this one more exaggerated as well. So if I pull these handles, they're called Bezier handles, out, you're going to see what happens. It started really slow. It sped up and then it slowed back down. It took longer to slow down. If I were to mess with these, let's say I do that, and let's say I do that. Well, this up and down axis in my graph is distance traveled or amount changed of that track. And the left and right axis is time. So in this first bit of the animation, the cube doesn't or does move a whole lot. You see it jumps, it lunges forward. And then in the middle of the animation, it kind of doesn't move a whole lot, and then it moves a lot in the end. So if I play this animation back, the interpolation between our first and last keyframes is very different. I could make it the opposite like I had before. I could stretch out and make it last very long with very little motion at the beginning and then have all the motion at the end. That's what this is. Look what happens. Aha. So you can really play, and this is what professional animators do in order to really kind of coax and refine their animations as they're going from different stages of blocking the animation out in its rough motion to making it polished and final. These keyframes in your graph can actually be changed in terms of how this Bezier handle behaves. If I click on one of these keyframes in the graph editor and I press the V key, the letter V on my keyboard, I can set the keyframe handle type. I'm not going to get into these. I just want you to know that they're there. So if I select something like free, I can then even have, a very much more control of this Bezier handle. And you'll notice the Bezier handle now is kind of broken into two. It's not in a straight line anymore. If you select one and tap V, you can select aligned, and that might do something that it didn't normally do. Again, I'm not going to get into this amount of control in this video. I just want you to be aware the V key is an option for you, and you can really precisely control things. If you're more familiar with vector graphics programs like Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, you might be more familiar in here and adjusting Bezier handles. But animation doesn't necessarily just happen with location, rotation, and scale with 3D objects in your viewport. You can animate settings and properties over on the right-hand side properties window for an object. If you noticed before with my cube selected in the object tab, it's this one in the properties editor, these value boxes for transform became different colors as I set keyframes. If you have a value box that has a number in it, or even we'll explore colors as well in this video a little bit later on, you'll notice the colors change, and you might notice there are dots near some of these value boxes. You can animate these. If I were to go back to the beginning of my animation and look at the cube, this box is turned yellow because there's a keyframe at that frame at this time, and I can actually adjust things over here as well. I do not have auto keying turned on right now. So if I adjust, let's say the location of the cube at that time, it does not have a keyframe right now. I can actually right click on this box and say insert keyframe or replace keyframe. I can actually press this little diamond here, and that will make sure that there's a keyframe there and it turns yellow. If I want to make rotation happen on this cube, there is no rotation right now. I actually don't need to do it up here with my gizmos and controls. I can actually go back to that keyframe and rotate here. Let's say I rotate the cube, and you can see it rotating over there as I drag in this value. And if I want to set a keyframe, I can right click, insert keyframe, or just click on that little dot. It'll turn it into a diamond. I get a keyframe. I can go later on to frame 48. I can change that value, and I can set a keyframe. I don't have auto keying turned on right now, so as I change these, I have to manually do it. Right click, insert keyframe, or press the little dot. So you can control any of these value boxes that have one of these dots. Sometimes you can do it without even one of these little dots or diamonds. If I go, let's say, to the color of, let's stick with the cube, and I add a material to this object, I'm going to add with the material tab selected. I'll press new. I'll choose a base color. I'll make it a blue cube. I can't see it yet though, because I do not have my viewport set to a view type of shading that I can see colors. There are two that you can, material viewport or material preview. This option right here, it used to be called Look Dev in Blender 2.80. Now in 2.81, it's called Material Preview. You can see the colors, or of course in the rendered viewport shading. Okay, I'll stick with Material Preview. You can see it's blue on this frame, on frame 10. I can actually right click on this box and say Insert Keyframe, and you'll see a material kind of track down here in a shader tree, and red, green, and blue and alpha values come up for the different primary colors of light on your object. So if I go later on, let's say to frame, I don't know, 28, sure, I can change this color. I'll make it red, and I will right click and say insert keyframe. There's no little dot there or diamond. Even if I make this wider, it doesn't exist, but I can still do animation. I can transition between colors. I can work with my keyframes down here. It's really simple and really great. It might not transition the way you thought. It went maybe across that circle, or it adjusted for each of these values, red, green, and blue. So it might not go between the exact colors that you like, but again, you can control the curves of that to your heart's content, but which is actually a lot more, I think, picky and advanced than I'm going to get in this video. The last thing I'll show you before we get into how you can move on and progress in animation is you can change the settings for different types of objects. If I go up to my add menu and I add a text object, which is not a mesh object, text under the add menu gives me this 2D special non-mesh. It's not a mesh, it's a text object, and it has a text or an object data with an A on it tab. And if I press tab to go into edit mode, it has an edit mode, but it has a cursor, and I can delete and I can type what I want. And I can press tab to go back into object mode. So I'm going to make born CG. and press tab. Under this object data tab for text, I can change the paragraph settings so I can make it, centered. And if I go into geometry, I can extrude the text to make it 3D. But I'm going to animate the letters starting very spaced out and coming together, so kind of merging into one word. It could be my new intro for my videos on this channel. So character spacing is right here. I can animate it. I'm going to start at frame 1, and I'm going to space letters more out. I'm going to right click and insert a keyframe on frame 40. Let's just do frame 48. I can change this down to 1, the default again, and click the diamond or right click insert keyframe. And so now in my animation, I've got letters coming together and balls and cubes flying around. Okay, so that's animation in Blender. That's an introduction with some details and a broader overview. If you want to learn more about animation and how to make good character and object animations, I would highly recommend another YouTuber's video on the 12 principles of animation. The 12 principles of animation are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead and pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, slow in, slow out, arc, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. If you want to check out an awesome YouTuber's video on these 12 principles of animation, his name is Alan Becker Tutorials, and I'll put a link to that on the screen and down in the video description below. It's well worth your time. The 12 principles of animation will help you understand what makes a good-looking animation. These 12 principles were thought up by two of the original Disney animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. They were some of the original, again, Disney animators from way back in the early days of Bambi and Cinderella, and they wrote a book about it, and that's where these 12 come from. So go ahead and check that out. But that will be it for this video. Go ahead and click on that like button if you learned something. Click on subscribe if you want to see more videos from me on this channel in Blender and in the Godot game engine. Check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post previews and sneak peeks, and I talk to you guys there the most. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.